Hearing of the Committee on Financial Services will come to order. The subject for today's hearing is the question of private equity and specifically the effect that purchases of existing companies by private equity has on the workers and the firms. There have been a number of concerns expressed about various new forms of activity in the economy. This committee has had some hearings, and we'll have more on the question of hedge funds. Today we are talking very specifically about private equity, and one special area of concern, I will say in general, I have not seen any argument that it is a matter for which public policy ought to be concerned as to whether people choose to own a company through a public shareholder method or privately. That seems to me a decision that ought to be left entirely to the people who are making the investments. But we do have concern about the impact on workers. The committee, myself and many others, have been concerned for some time about increasing inequality in America. A year ago, we were debating the question about whether real wages, were seriously lagging growth. We were debating inequality. That debate is largely over. There is general agreement that we have increasing inequality and that real wages have, in fact, lagged. There was a period earlier this year when they began to go up. That is now once again in jeopardy. I find a situation in which this country prospers overall, but the increased wealth is enjoyed by a relatively small number of people, morally wrong, because it takes the efforts of most people to produce that wealth, and it should be shared less unfairly. No one is talking about equality. We're talking about degrees of inequality. I believe that the case for being concerned about this excessive inequality goes beyond moral considerations, fortunately, for those of us who hope to get anything accomplished. There is a big debate in this country now about immigration. There's a debate about trade. We are engaged in the question about how welcoming we should be to foreign investment, direct foreign investment. As more and more Americans have become convinced that economic growth, globalization, technological change do them very little good and in some cases harm, you have seen increasing resistance to the kind of public policies that many in the business community believe are in the interest of economic growth. And until we are able to diminish this trend of increasing inequality, I believe that resistance will grow. Now, with regard to private equity, I assume that the market is rational and that the private equity method increases value. I don't think people make deals in large numbers for no good reason. The question we have is, does any of that increased value accrue to the people who work in the companies? Conversely, there is the fear that to the extent that private equity is accompanied by significant increases in debt in some cases, this may have a negative effect on workers. Now, it ties into some of the other concerns we've had in terms of compensation. We're talking here not about compensation paid by shareholders, which is a matter we dealt with elsewhere, but the compensation that some individuals get when a small number of individuals benefit from a particular deal in the tens and sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars, and concurrently workers are laid off. We have a situation which seems to me wrong. Now, the question, of course, then is, well, what are we going to do about it? It's not clear. There may or may not be public policy implications, but to the extent that there are public policies that have an effect on the private equity situation, some which would come before this committee, some which would deal with taxation, which would come before other committees, to the extent that we see gross imbalances, then we are going to have to act. And based, as an example of that, I would ask to put into the record the article from today's New York Times, headlined "Unkind Cut for Janitors at Hilfiger," which says that in the consequence of a $1.6 billion buyout of Tommy Hilfiger, janitors making $19 an hour were fired to be replaced by janitors making $8 an hour. The Hilfiger company is bought for $1.6 billion. Janitors show up to work. They were making $19 an hour, union wages. They are fired, and they are going to be replaced by people getting $8 an hour. Mr. Hilfiger got $66 million as a result of the sale, and will get $14.5 million a year through 2010. Workers in their 40s and 50s have been laid off with 1 day's notice. I do not know, as I said, whether public policy can or can't do anything about that. I do know that this is the sort of pattern that will make many of us determined to do something. So the point is a very simple one. If we have a situation in private equity where enormous values are created, as apparently they are if people get these large sums of money, and the workers are either no better off or worse off, then from the public policy standpoint, that seems to me to be undesirable. Whether or not there are public policy remedies is the second question. But the first question I want to focus on today is whether there is such a pattern and whether we can do something about it. I must say, and let me say in closing, many of the areas of private equity, you're talking about hotel workers, we're talking about service employees in buildings, we're talking about janitors. These are not people who are competing with low-wage workers elsewhere. These are people serving in very low-wage capacities, the wealthiest people in the society. And I think America can do better. Whether or not there's a public policy response, we will take into account, but it could have effect on policies involving unionization, taxation, and elsewhere. But that is the question. The concern that the way in which private equity deals go forward may be exacerbating what is already an unfortunate trend in America for growth to go forward, for wealth to increase, but for inequality to increase even faster. The gentleman from Alabama.